right, guys. Today we're going to be talking about different methods of reproduction. Hopefully you've been looking over your types of cell division notes, and you know the difference between mitosis and meiosis. So we're going to add a little bit of information to that and talk about the different types of reproduction. Hopefully we all know that the two major categories of reproduction that we've studied in the past are asexual and sexual reproduction. So living organisms, they're either going to reproduce asexually or sexually. Okay, now viruses, on the other hand, and I know you're probably sick and tired of hearing about viruses lately. Okay, but viruses, remember we talked about that there's a debate as to whether they're living or non-living. They don't have cells, they don't grow, they don't use energy, but they do have DNA and they do evolve. So there are, some different pieces of evidence for both camps, either living or non-living. But one of the things that kind of makes them different from living organisms is that they can't reproduce on their own. They must infect a host cell in order to reproduce. All right, here in this diagram, we see asexual reproduction. It involves a cell. That's how you can kind of remember that. So just a parent cell that splits into two identical cells. Whereas sexual reproduction, it's going to involve two cells that are combining their DNA. These cells are combining, their DNA is combining, and it's producing a offspring that is genetically different. All right, so let's get on into this. We're going to talk about asexual reproduction first. The general characteristics of asexual reproduction. First of all, it's the creation of offspring from a single parent. So remember, asexual reproduction, a single parent. It might help you remember that. The offspring that are created are going to be genetically identical to the parents because basically you have one parent cell and it's either splitting into two or part of it is breaking off, but there's no changes in the DNA. So it does not involve the joining of gametes. So you don't have a sperm and an egg that are coming together or pollen and egg that are coming together. It's just one cell involved. All right, so that's just an overview of asexual reproduction. Now we're going to talk about some different types of asexual reproduction. The first one is binary fission. Bi, think of two when you think of bi. Okay, so this is, of course, asexual. This particular type is used by prokaryotes, which we know whenever we hear prokaryote, we should think of bacteria. Okay, so this is the way bacterial cells would reproduce. It's through binary fission, and basically it just splits into two equal cells. So one cell splits into two. Don't confuse this with fusion. Okay, so fusion would mean to come together. Fission means to split. Okay, all right, the next type is budding. Budding is also asexual, but it's used by eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotes will carry out this type of reproduction, specifically some types of fungi and some other invertebrate organisms. But basically what happens is a small projection grows on the surface of the parent organism. I say it grows a buddy. Okay, so budding, buddy. So it grows a little buddy, and eventually that little buddy gets big enough that it separates and becomes its own individual. You're going to see this sometimes in yeast and in hydra, which are related to jellyfish. Okay, so that's two of the types of asexual reproduction. We got a couple others we want to discuss. Okay, but first, here's binary fission. You have this one parent cell. Here's the DNA. We see the DNA replicating, and then the cell splits into two, and you end up with two new offspring, but each of them are going to be genetically identical. Here with budding, you see the little buddy kind of growing off, coming off of that parent organism. This is a hydra. Kind of looks like a jellyfish with the tentacles. Okay, and eventually that buddy gets big enough that it just breaks off, it detaches and becomes its own individual organism. And this is what it would look like in yeast. yeast is the single-celled fungi. So it would form a little buddy, and eventually it would get big enough and become its own cell. All right. The next type is fragmentation. A fragment is like a piece of something. So that it should give you a hint as to kind of what happens. It's asexual reproduction. It's also used by eukaryotes. And the parent organism splits into pieces, into fragments. And then each of those can grow into a new organism. This type of reproduction, we see it in flatworms and in sea stars, which is, they're both invertebrates. Vegetative propagation. Hopefully you can kind of tell by the name. This is something that is carried out by plants. We call it vegetative reproduction or vegetative propagation. It's asexual, and of course it's carried out by eukaryotes. And basically a stem, a leaf, or a root will produce a new individual. And then when it's detached from the parent. Your grandmother, your mom, your aunt may have one time, broken off part of a plant, and you could root it in water and then eventually plant it in soil. That would be a type of vegetative propagation, an example of that. Sometimes you'll see plants, they'll grow out what are called these adventitious roots that grow away from the parent plant, and then some other smaller plants will pop up off of that root. That would be vegetative propagation. So we're going to see this in plants such as strawberries, potatoes, and even in larger plants like aspen trees. They all are interconnected by their roots. Okay. So now let's just maybe think about, let's look at the pictures first. We got a type of flatworm here, and you see it's split into different pieces, into fragments, and then each one grows into an individual flatworm. And then here with vegetative propagation, you've got this adventitious root growing off from this parent plant, and then you see the smaller new plant coming up, and they would be identical. All right, some advantages and disadvantages. One of the advantages of asexual reproduction is that it can rapidly produce offspring. As long as the environmental conditions are good, offspring are going to form pretty quickly, and they don't have to spend time looking for a mate, or spend that energy looking for a mate. The disadvantages is that the organisms that are produced, they're going to lack genetic diversity. Excuse me. Now, you may think, so what? But genetic diversity is what enables a species to survive when there are changes in the environment. So, if there's no genetic diversity, this puts the entire population at a risk of dying off. Okay, so those are basically some pros and cons, some advantages and disadvantages of asexual reproduction. All right, so next let's talk about the different types of sexual reproduction. So just a general overview first. Sexual reproduction is going to be the creation of offspring by joining of two gametes. So you have two cells coming together. Remember, gametes are eggs, sperm, and pollen. So you have one gamete from each of the two parents are going to unite, and this is called fertilization. So the fusion, the coming together of the two gametes, that's fertilization. Okay, now the offspring that are created are going to be genetically unique because you have DNA from two different cells coming together. And so the offspring are going to be genetically unique or genetically different from the parents. All right, so some different types of sexual reproduction. First one is a real simple system. It's used by some protists and some fungi, and basically you have organisms with two different mating types, a positive and a negative mating type, and they fuse together and form a new organism. In plants, in flowering plants, the pollen, and we see a lot of pollen right now. I don't know if y'all been outside. You need to get outside if you haven't been outside. But a lot of pollen in the air right now. But the pollen is the male gamete, and it's going to be transferred to the ovary. Remember the parts of the flower that we learned earlier. So it's transferred to the ovary of the flower where the egg is housed. And then after pollination, one part of the pollen grows a tube down the style to reach the ovary, and then the other part of the pollen grain produces two sperm. So one sperm is going to fertilize the egg, and then the other sperm is going to combine with the nuclei in the embryo sac, and it creates the endosperm. Now, the endosperm is the food supply for the developing embryo, and so this is what we call double fertilization, which should make sense because you got two sperm and they're each fertilizing something, and so double fertilization. Now, in animals like humans, you're going to have courtship behaviors, and this leads to the sperm fertilizing the egg, and it's going to be either internally or externally. All right. Okay, and this is just showing you that positive and negative mating types. This is in like hyphae in different types of fungi like mushrooms and stuff. So you would have that real simple positive and negative mating type coming together. All right, here this is like remember we talked about we learned the parts of the flower. This is the female parts of the flower. Remember the carpel. You got the stigma, the style, the ovary. Okay, so you see that pollen grain attaching to the stigma, and then the style, that tube that runs down, and then you're going to have the two different pollen and two different sperm cells, and they're going to fertilize. One fertilizing the egg, and the other fertilizing the nuclei to form the endosperm. All right, so advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. The advantages are that the organisms that are produced are going to be genetically diverse, and this is going to enable them to survive better. So they are better equipped to survive when there are environmental changes. So, of course, this is going to increase the chance for survival as a population. All right, now disadvantages, fewer offspring are going to be produced. It takes longer. You're not going to have that rapid reproduction like you would see in asexual reproduction. And also, organisms have to spend time and energy looking for a mate. Okay. All right, so then that brings us to viral reproduction. Now, we've heard a lot about viruses recently in the news with obviously the coronavirus. And then we talked about viruses at the beginning of the year. Remember, we talked about how, or the beginning of the semester, we talked about how viruses are sometimes considered living by some people and non-living by others, and that they have characteristics that kind of are evidence that points to both camps. So one of the things that makes viruses different from living organisms is that they must infect a host cell in order to reproduce. They can't reproduce on their own. Now, once they're in a host cell, they're either going to cause a lytic or a lysogenic infection. All right, here, notice this particular virus. This is a bacteriophage. It's got a protein coat, and then it has DNA inside, and then that DNA would be injected into a cell. So this would land on a cell, and then it would inject its DNA into that cell. Now, the coronavirus, it looks a little different from this. It's kind of circular, and it has spikes on it, and it has a protein coat, but it also has like a lipid layer around it, and that's why it's really important that we wash our hands, because that lipid is like a fat, like grease, so soap helps dissolve that, and that's what is going to help us a lot in protecting ourselves from the coronavirus. But it has RNA instead of DNA, and so RNA gets read by our ribosomes to help create proteins. So when it injects its RNA into the cell, the RNA, the cell thinks that it needs to read that RNA to create the proteins. So it reads that RNA and starts making proteins that basically cause the cell to start building these different viral parts. And so that's kind of how the coronavirus works. So wash your hands. That's going to be really, really important. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the different types of infection. A lytic infection, okay, this is when the viral DNA is going to enter the host cell and it immediately takes over. So the DNA enters and then takes over the host DNA. And then it turns on the genes that make it necessary to copy the viral genes. The virus forces the host cell to produce the proteins that make up the outside of the virus and the enzymes needed for viral replication. Then the virus takes energy from its host cell and assembles new viruses. So it just basically turns that cell into a virus-making machine. And then the virus forces the host cell to burst, and it releases new viruses into the host body. Okay, and so I think of this as kind of a real quick type of infection. So lytic, it like immediately enters and it immediately just takes over. It's not trying to hide. It just gets in there and gets started. Okay, so that's a lytic infection. All right, now and here we see like this bacteriophage, it injects its DNA, and then its DNA gets in there and it just starts taking over and starts making viral parts until the cell just breaks open and all these viruses are released. Now, a lysogenic infection, okay, this is where the viral DNA enters the host cell and then it inserts itself into the host DNA. So, to me, that's kind of a key word there. It inserts itself. So, it kind of is like a secret agent. It gets in there and kind of lays low for a little while. It becomes part of what's going on and doesn't like immediately start taking over. So each time that the host DNA replicates, the viral DNA replicates with it. And then it's passed on to each new cell produced by mitosis. So it's kind of a gradual thing. And then the viral DNA will continue replicating with each host cell until a stressor triggers the virus to become lytic. A virus like the virus that causes fever blisters, it's a herpes virus. It's going to be lysogenic. It kind of lays low and then something triggers it. Maybe you get too much sun, or it could be something that you're eating or whatever, and it can cause it to go into that lytic cycle, and then that's when you get a fever blister. Okay, so that's lysogenic infection. All right, and you can see that here. It inserts the DNA, and then it just becomes part of the cell's DNA and just keeps replicating with the cell. Okay, so that is the three types of reproduction. You've got the asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction, and viral reproduction. You need to know the major differences between each and examples of each. Okay, so make sure you got your notes. If you need to go back and look at the PowerPoint again, you can do that. And then you're going to want to go in and do the activities that are associated with this PowerPoint. All right, y'all, I'll see you later.